sex, culture, social origin, or political or religious ideas. I think that's a strong statement of equality that should make Montanans proud, even if it is not always practiced. We have an explicit right to participate in the Constitution, and that's a requirement that state and local governments, school boards, and the like can't make decisions without including the public. Courts have struck down some of these decisions that are made without public participation. There's one case where a couple of county commissioners in a small county went to a coffee shop to decide on an issue. That was overruled by a court, and rightly so. Without advance public notice, a public meeting is not considered an open meeting. We have a constitutional right to know in the Constitution. This is a rare constitutional right, and this was one of the most controversial rights debated in the Constitutional Convention. Media groups opposed it, saying it could impede freedom of the press and the like. In the reality, it's worked out pretty well. The law says, the constitutional provision says that public has a right to know and examine documents unless there's an overriding right to privacy. Media groups have gone to court often, and some citizens, and we usually win most of the cases. We formed a group called the Montana Freedom of Information Hotline, which I'm on the board of, funded by media grants and public grants to field questions from the public on these issues. Anyone can call and ask our attorney for advice. Our attorney is Mike Malloy, a well-known lawyer who handles a lot of right-to-know cases. The most frequent complaints, I should add, are usually against law enforcement agencies, with school districts and school boards a close second. Using a combination of this right and other rights, media groups successfully sued to open the legislative caucuses in another controversial decision. The caucuses still exist, but they're mostly just press conferences. It was sort of a Pyrrhic victory. But I like the idea that they can't meet in private in the Capitol. If they want to meet at the Colonial or Jorgensen's, that's their right, but I don't think they should meet privately in the Capitol. Montana is also one of the few states with an explicit right to privacy in our Constitution. The Montana Supreme Court has cited this right in striking down the state's anti-sodomy law. It's used that to strike down some restrictions on abortion. It's a powerful right. As Elliott and Snyder say in their book, the Montana Supreme Court has stated that privacy provisions in the state constitution provide greater protection for individual privacy in search and seizure cases than the federal law does. We also have a right to a clean and healthful environment, a topic I know you've talked about, and there have been some important cases on that. The delegates included an extremely important provision, the equality of educational opportunity, which essentially says every student across the state, whether he or she is in Winnett or Billings, is entitled to an equal opportunity of education. That's been the subject of two very intense and ultimately successful lawsuits filed by school districts that have led to millions of dollars more being spent on K-12 education and allocations in different ways. Very important decision. The Constitution also recognizes, quote, the distinct and unique cultural heritage of the American Indians, unquote, and asserts that the state is, quote, committed to its educational goals to the preservation of their cultural integrity, unquote. This has led to the creation of what's known as the Indian Education for All program in every school in Montana. I'm a product of Montana schools. We learned virtually nothing about our native people when I was going to school, and I went to good schools. I think it's a wonderful thing. Another major change is when delegates gave constitutional standing and independence to the Montana University system through its Board of Regents, appointed by the governor and confirmed by the Senate. This was an important change, particularly in light of some tendency of past elected officials to interfere with the university system on issues of academic freedom. Delegates also provided for a CEO or a head of the university system to be known as the Montana Commissioner of Higher Education. In the Revenue and Finance article, the state created the right of the state created the statewide reappraisal, assessment, and equalization of property. This proved to be one of the most controversial issues and still is. The change was made because prior to that, as we heard in the last panel, it was all done locally, and there were instances where local officials showed favoritism toward friends, relatives, political supporters, and the like. Now we have one statewide reappraisal, which I think is a good thing. It remains controversial. Every few years there'll be a proposed constitutional amendment to go back to local reappraisal, but so far legislators have beaten it back. The Constitution also provided for the first time that anyone can do a constitutional initiative, not just the legislature. And the public has used this often. Very few have qualified for the ballot, and even fewer yet pass, but people do have that right and no longer have to just wait for the legislature to propose it. Another foresight, I think, was the decision by the delegates to have an automatic vote every 20 years whether there should be another constitutional convention. I think that's very important. We've had two so far, and voters have said no, we like what we have, but someday there might come a time when they won't have one, and I think that's an easy way to do it. I'd like to use some of my time to talk about areas where I think changes are needed, particularly in the legislative branch. Our legislature today has become a shadow of what the Constitutional Convention delegates envisioned. It's by far the weakest branch of the three, and often overpowered by a strong governor and the Supreme Court. Two of the major reasons it's weak, I think, are two voter-passed initiatives. After trying annual sessions just once, in 1973 and 1974, some unhappy legislators and lobbying groups decided that was enough, and they got the first constitutional initiative passed to revert back to biennial sessions, although for more days. I think meeting every 90 days every 2 years really restricts the ability of the legislature to be active participants in the ever-changing developments in state government. After they adopt the budget in the first year, they really have no say on it the next 18 months. Likewise with state policy, which can change often with a court decision or other developments. I'm not advocating a full-time professional legislature like California has. Rather, I believe Montana should look to a system like some states have, like Idaho and Wyoming. Maybe a 30-day session 1 year for budget matters and a 60-day the next year for general legislation. The other major constitutional initiative that has generally weakened the legislature is term limits. It passed in 1992 as part of an effort by a group called U.S. Term Limits to get control of the Congress out of the Democrats' hands. It was a Republican-funded group, and they went after Congress, but also included state legislatures and state officials, and it passed in a number of states. The U.S. Supreme Court, shortly thereafter, threw out the attack on the term limits of members of Congress, saying only Congress can change the terms of members of Congress. But it's remained for the rest of state government, and a number of states haven't. In Montana, there's almost a natural term limit for governors at 2 terms and attorney general at 2 terms, and that sort of thing. Where it really hits worse is at the legislature, a part-time body. A legislator who serves his or her full 8 years in the legislature part-time, 90 days times 4 legislative sessions, would serve 360 days out of 8 years, which doesn't give many people a chance to really learn the complex issues like education, funding, health care, taxation policy, social services, housing, the other kind of policies. And it also has changed the relationship legislators have with each other. In the days before term limits, it wasn't uncommon for legislators to have fierce debates during the day and then go out and have a drink or dinner together at night. They could still get the job done even if they disagreed on this issue or that issue. And they sort of saw the greater good of this for the state. The legislature before term limits was hardly perfect. I mean, it was a highly experienced legislature in 1997 that enacted utility deregulation, which is one of the worst decisions in state history, in my opinion. 15 states still have term limits for legislators, according to the National Conference on State Legislatures. Only 4 states have biennial legislative sessions, like Montana. Only 2 states, Montana and Nevada, have the combination of both term limits and biennial sessions. I've been around every legislative session since 1971, except for one. I would say without a doubt the 2011 session was the most dysfunctional I've ever seen. Legislators proposed nearly 100 bills that their own professional legal and research staff told them were unconstitutional or otherwise illegal. That didn't bother them, they still dropped them in. Some of these bills and some of the comments by legislators on the floor were in committee, went viral, and made Montana a national laughingstock. Governor Schweitzer didn't help matters with his design for television branding theatrics outside the Capitol. For those that you didn't follow, he had a veto branding iron and seared planks of wood to symbolize bills, and his actions marginalized the Republican-controlled legislature even more. He treated the Republicans poorly, and I think they returned it. The legislative branch is my own personal favorite. It brings together men and women from all parts of the state, from all kinds of backgrounds, young and old, to try to reach some consensus on policy and the budget. It was personally sad to see this branch become an embarrassment last session. Will it get any better in 2013? We'll see what the 2012 elections bring. I would hope Montanans would pay more attention to these legislative elections and perhaps in a bipartisan way look at some structural changes that are needed in this branch. In the days around the Constitutional Convention or prior to that, there were a number of citizen groups that formed to push changes. There was, of course, always the League of Women Voters. There was the Montana chapter of the National Citizens Conference on State Legislatures, and a number of groups. We don't see many of those anymore, and I think it would be helpful if we did have some private groups made up of diverse groups of citizens take some good looks at some of our government and look at areas where we can improve it. You know, the Constitutional Convention, I think delegates would tell you, made a major attempt to try to strengthen the legislature with annual sessions, open meetings, right to participate. They set the example. They even agonized over whether to go to a unicameral or one-house legislature, and in the end put it on the ballot as a side issue, and voters chose to go with the two-house legislature. They provided for single-member legislative districts, so various candidates could have smaller districts to campaign in, and voters could get to know the legislative candidates. In the days past, a candidate in Billings could run county-wide, and voters in Billings would elect 8